take the concept of having a job, deciding that for most of your waking hours, you will rent yourself to a tyrant who has total control over you, total subordination for most of your waking hours to tyranny. Remember, we're looking at a society which has had 400 years of vicious repression, virtually unremitting, to the present, leaving a very bitter legacy. There's a lot to unravel. So this awakening to looking at what our wealth is based on, what our privilege is based on, who's been suffering, that's important. As soon as you start looking at what's in front of you, like your computer, the screen that we're both looking at, you see quite a different story. These are, again, things that people don't think about. It's in front of your eyes, but you don't think about it. We should carefully protect freedom of speech. It's the fundamental right that we should make sure to give very high priority to.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Noam Chomsky, the American linguist, philosopher, political activist, and professor emeritus at MIT. You are a leading figure in analytic philosophy, cognitive science, and are widely regarded as the father of modern linguistics. Your academic career has spanned 8 decades, and you are laureate professor at the University of Arizona. You've written more than 100 books on topics such as linguistics, war, politics, and mass media, and hold the status as the most quoted living author. As outspoken as ever, you continue to rally against the mainstream media and the culture war in America while campaigning for our civil liberties, including freedom of speech. Noam Chomsky, welcome to London Real.
Pleased to be with you.
Great to have you here. Before we get started, I just want to announce that we are streaming now on our brand new Digital Freedom Platform, which is a censorship-free, independent broadcasting system that is of the people, by the people, for the people, and it's available exclusively on our website at freedomplatform.tv. Professor Chomsky, I pledge to you and everyone watching us that none of this conversation will be edited, censored, removed, or banned, and that anyone in the world can watch the free version of this episode at freedomplatform.tv/Chomsky. Thanks to the generous donations of over 33,000 people around the world that I affectionately call the London Real Army. For anybody wanting to become a founding member of the Digital Freedom Platform, they can visit freedomplatform.tv/give to donate and fight with us on the front lines to protect our human rights. Here at London Real, we've been a platform for free speech since 2011. And Noam, I'm excited to talk to you here today. I wanted to kick off with the topic of freedom of speech. For 9 years, we broadcasted here with no problems until April 6th, when one of the biggest live streams in the world was shut down and then banned and deleted on YouTube. And now I've been introduced to this concept of censorship, which I always thought happened to the other guy. I'm curious, how do you see freedom of speech in the digital era?
Well, digital speech has always been, speech and writing have always been tightly controlled. Nobody ever paid any attention to it because the targets were overwhelmingly on the left, and so therefore it was considered perfectly normal and okay. Now the targets are ranging more widely, right-wing interests, of course, becoming an issue. But we should carefully protect freedom of speech. It's the fundamental right that we should make sure to give very high priority to, no matter whose ox is being gored.
And when you look at it in the digital era, I mean, so much of our lives are lived online now and digitally, and yet it's not something I can voice. Now it has to go through a platform like YouTube or Twitter or Facebook that's now controlled by, sometimes $1 trillion company in Silicon Valley, sometimes a monopoly. How does that change the whole dynamic of freedom of speech?
Well, Facebook has enormous power to control speech, but and there's a question how they should be treated. My feeling is that they should be regarded very much like any other media organization. So they shouldn't be under any government control, but they should be subject to whatever conditions the regular media are. So, for example, I don't believe in libel suits, but if there are libel laws, they ought to be subjected to the same laws that the Times or the Guardian are. I don't think British libel laws, I think, are outrageous, but even more mild ones, I think one should be very cautious about. However, to free them from that seems to give them a kind of an unfair position relative to the regular media.
And I know you once said that even though the First Amendment protects freedom of speech, it wasn't until really the civil rights movements where those were really put to the test. Because I think you said before, you actually have to fight for that and constantly fight for that freedom because it's not just a given.
The First Amendment doesn't protect freedom of speech. The First Amendment, if you read it, protects prior restraint. But you can be punished for the speech under the First Amendment. First Amendment doesn't say anything about that. Actually, it wasn't until the 20th century that the issue started reaching the High Court, the Supreme Court. If you look at the early statements mildly supporting freedom of speech, they were actually dissents by Holmes and Brandeis, and very weak ones. Really wasn't until basically the civil rights movement that a strong stand was taken by the courts in favor of freedom of speech. So in Times v. Sullivan, 1964, the Supreme Court for the first time struck down the principle of sovereign immunity, which Britain still has, incidentally, which means you can't attack the sovereign by words. That was a case. And then a little bit later in Brandenburg v. Ohio in 1969, the Supreme Court hit the highest standard that's, I think, ever been reached in protecting freedom of speech. This, incidentally, was a Ku Klux Klan case. It's a hated organization, but it said they had the right to speech. And the criterion that was established was basically that speech should be free up to participation in imminent criminal acts, which means that if you and I go into a store and I have a gun and you plan to rob it and you say, shoot, that's not permitted speech. That's basically the idea. And of course, it's very flexible. None of these principles are precise. They will have to be interpreted. But the general idea is that speech should be generally quite free, short of participation in criminal acts. Now, that does raise questions. So, for example, suppose that some neo-Nazi organization decides to put up a huge billboard in Times Square in New York, overlooking Times Square, which says, "Kikes to the crematoria." Should that be permitted? I wouldn't object myself if that were taken down, though I think you could give an argument that they should do it. My own feeling is the way to deal with hateful speech is not to silence it, but to expose it. And it can be done. one of the striking examples in the United States. The United States is probably beyond any other country that I know in protection of freedom of speech. There was a case, must have been 20 years ago or so, when a neo-Nazi group wanted to have a parade through a town in Illinois, Skokie, Illinois, which is full of Holocaust survivors and so on. They want to have an anti-Semitic demonstration right down the main street. And it was permitted. The ACLU, the Civil Liberties Union, supported it. The town accepted it. Turned out very well. They organized a counter-demonstration to try to expose them. The group was frightened off, never even showed up.
And you think that's a better way to allow it to happen out in the open, as opposed to, say, block it? Like in Europe, Holocaust deniers, it's illegal, but you think that sometimes it's not the best tactical move because it gives them maybe more exposure as opposed to just letting it out there in the open.
But I think sometimes the exposure is good. So take a case that just happened, and where I'm sure you read, Senator Tom Cotton had an op-ed in the New York Times, which aroused the furor, and they finally took it off. And in fact, the editor from the web page, the editor resigned and so on. Personally, I think it was very good to publish it. It's very good to know that people in high places have the kinds of beliefs that he does, that these are people who are really fundamentally criminals, basic criminals. We should know that. I think it was important when the major newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, published op-eds by John Bolton, former national security advisor, in which he called for bombing Iran right now. So let's be the worst criminal state since the Nazis, because we don't like them. I think it's important to know that the national security advisor is a neo-Nazi. I don't want that to be secret.
When the internet came about, were you expecting that because we could bypass the mainstream media, there would be finally the democratization of free speech? I mean, were you expecting that? Because when I look at it now, it seems like in some ways the opposite has happened.
Well, the digital media have a strange impact. Technically, they should be increasing freedom of speech. But in fact, what's happening, I think, is that people are being directed into bubbles where they never hear anything except their own views reported. And so it's kind of technically freedom of speech, but effectively it's probably reducing it.
Yeah, and it's strange.
Change that by law. That has to be changed by practice, understanding, change of consciousness.
Yeah, you're right, because we end up creating these echo chambers that feed back what we want to hear. We banish the views that we don't want to hear. And then even these days, it seems like it becomes so populist where there's this cancel culture. When anyone says something unpopular, they just get relegated off the platform. So in some ways, freedom of speech has almost been lost by democratizing it.
We have to remember that cancel culture and deplatforming are very old. I could give you many examples from my own personal experience, but it was always against the left. So therefore it wasn't considered a problem. You didn't even notice it. I mean, there are cases that are so extreme, they're almost hard to believe. Let me give you a real case. My friend Ed Herman, late Ed Herman, and I published many books together. One of them is on the media and manufacturing consent. The first book we published together was in 1971, a book called Count.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.